Today's guest is Linta Mustafa. She's the co-founder and CEO of Vitract. Linta is a former national wrestler with an educational background in genetics. She started Vitract after ending her wrestling career due to a rheumatoid arthritis diagnosis. She is driven to help people like her who are struggling to find help in traditional care. After years of looking for the right functional whole body care, Linta noticed that specialized testing like gut tests were extremely expensive and hard to access. This is what drove her to build Vitract. Vitract exists not only to build gut testing that is superior and more sensitive than other gut tests, but to also make gut testing far more accessible than it is today.
Welcome to Simply Walk the Talk. Our bodies and minds adapt to what we do most of the time. If you want to change your body and mind, you must change what it is you do most of the time. This podcast explores all things health, wellness, fitness, lifestyle, and biohacking. Stay tuned as we explore various thoughts, methods, and experiences from a multitude of conversations between our interesting guests and experts through many fields of work. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Simply walk the talk. Simply walk the talk.
Linta Mustafa, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Josh. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So first of all, I'd love to get a shout out to Shaker Pie. He's the one who introduced us, and he's a big part of connecting me with people like yourself. And it's really nice and wonderful to be able to finally meet you. And I do remember that while I was doing some work in Toronto, there was like a small window of opportunity that we may have been able to meet up, and it ended up not working out just because of the timing. However, it was nice to be in your neck of the woods and to know that you're doing some really amazing things. So here we are, finally able to get on the show to talk through all there is to talk through about Vitract and gut testing and everything else. And so I want to thank you for your time and welcome to the show. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, Toronto is wonderful in the summer. So you were there at the
Yeah. Well, I will say that I was there in February and I was in and out of Toronto till like middle of June. So I got a chance to experience the extreme cold. And you know what's really funny about that is when I was there, it was just crazy cold for a couple of times because I went all the way up to North Bay. We did some shooting in North Bay, which was like we were on the, I guess you would call it the lake or the ocean. I don't know what body of water it was, but it was completely frozen over, and they did some shooting on the actual body of water that was frozen, which was kind of crazy. But what shocked me was that here I am like freezing. Coming from New York, right? New York, it gets cold, but many of the people in Toronto were like, oh yeah, this is a very mild winter. And I'm like, what?
I do remember it being like the mildest winter that we've had in a very...
Well, kudos to you for hanging in there. I actually really, really like Toronto. It's one of those cities that is very similar to New York City. I know a lot of people say that. It's like a small or miniature New York City. And, I look forward to spending some more time there. And then knowing that you're there doing the work that you're doing, I think it'll be great to kind of keep that line of communication open. I would love to kind of direct the show by starting out with your background, because when I read off your bio, one of the things that jumped out to me is that you were a national wrestler, right? Like, can you tell me about that? Like, tell me what that entails, and then we can show how that leads into what you're doing today.
Yeah, so I wrestled in collegiate varsity at university. You know, there wasn't a lot of female wrestlers, even, this is a while ago, but even at the time and today. So we had a team of 40, and about 4 or 5 of us were female wrestlers. So it is still quite uncommon. But I think it's such a fun sport. You literally fall over 100 times a day. get back up. So it's a very unique feeling. Training for wrestling is very, very technical. You get on the mat and you practice every type of position, reaction possible. And then even when you get in the ring, it's, you don't know what that match is really going to go like. So I think it teaches you a lot of fundamental skills about how to make the best of any situation, how to fall and get up and really push your limits and take those skills and you can apply them to really anything.
What were some of the challenges you experienced back then? Like, what are some things that maybe surprised you about wrestling, especially as a female? And what are some things that maybe carried over into other parts of your life beyond what you just mentioned?
Yeah. Some of the things that surprised me were how adaptive and resilient the human body is. So wrestling season, unlike most sports, is all year round. You wrestle from the start of the school year to the end of the school year, but then you do get summer off. So your body kind of readjusts, you aren't keeping up that training like a lot of the athletes did. You tend to kind of fall out of it a little bit. And then when you start back up, you notice that within just a couple of weeks of training, we would train hours and hours a day. We would train 3 hours in the evening. And then most of the wrestlers would still go in and put in some time in the morning. So it was doing all that stuff while balancing a whole course load. But within a couple of weeks of putting your body through that many hours of training, you really start to see the differences. And I think one of the other things that surprised me too is the movements that you're typically used to doing in the gym. So working all those big muscles, that's not really the areas that you see that you're working out when you're wrestling, right? It's all of the smaller muscles, the muscles that kind of hold everything together so you can be strong in the postures that you're in. Those are the things that become really strong. When someone goes to push you down or move you backwards, you're so strong that it's so hard for them to even be able to move you an inch. So that to me was super fascinating. One of the things I think that was really interesting that I haven't maybe mentioned is the skills that you learn in terms of balancing your life as a student. So your friends, living on campus to a full course load. I was pre-med at the time to focus on genetics and then training all those hours. You really learn to be a well-oiled machine. There's a time and place for everything. And so getting really good at organization is another thing that I took away from wrestling.
Yeah, that is very fascinating. And I love this potential for maybe the analogy or the comparison of the literal and the figurative word of balance, right? So you've got the balance of your life, of your career, of your path outside of wrestling, but then you've got the literal balance and stability that you can build from a performance perspective in the physicality. And I love how you touched on the fact that being pushed and learning how to fall and pushing and pulling all the time, it really does help to enhance your connective tissue. And this is one of the things that I think most people, especially like if you're into the world of UFC and you understand wrestlers are some of the toughest athletes out there, it's because they're constantly being pulled on and pushed on. And, in some aspects, they're defending this opportunity or this situation in which their life can be taken away by getting choked out, and having to be resilient through that makes them a more resilient person. So I think there is a lot of crossover there, and I think it does apply to our daily life. I think it's really, really fascinating. So like moving on from that, again, in the bio, we talked about you getting a diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis. Is that something that came out of, like, had you already finished your wrestling career, or is this something you discovered during your wrestling career? Like, how did that come up?
Yeah, so I was in second year in university, and for me, the onset was really sudden. So I woke up one day, I was fine the day before, woke up the next day and had all this inflammation in the joints of my hands. And I thought, this is so strange. Maybe like I slept funny. Maybe I slept on my hand. I really didn't know what it was. And so I went to go see the doctor on campus, and he took one look at me and he said, this is not arthritis. This is something else. And he put in a referral for me to see a rheumatologist. And from there, I basically spent the next 2 years, so almost the entirety of the remaining years at university, just trying to figure out what this was. At one point they said, this is RA. And then at one point they said, this is lupus. And then they said, we don't really know what it is. Something autoimmune in nature. And that's quite common actually in the autoimmune world. But for me, I really struggled with that because that inflammation in my joints meant that all of the intense training that we did on the mat just became that much harder. And funny enough, I actually ended up just dropping out, leaving the team, and not ever expressing to my coach why I left. To this day, I think about why I never told them. And I just felt like I was so young at the time, I didn't really know how to explain it. And also it just felt like the medical system didn't know how to explain it to me. And in turn, I didn't know how to explain it to the coach. So I just ended up walking away from the team, which is pretty crazy
Maybe you can show them this episode once it comes out and say, hey guys,
I'm going to send them this link. Yeah, they were like, well, Linta, just stop wrestling. So yeah. And I was lucky that at the time I was in all these genetics courses and I could read a research paper pretty quickly. So when I started to get all these confusing sort of back and forth with my specialist, I just went, all right, I'm going to go and do the research myself. And I started reading all these papers and I figured out that there's a whole world out there of integrative care practitioners, of integrative care modalities. And depending on the specialists you end up speaking to, they either hint at those things and they bring them up, or they just don't at all, which is the most. And so that's what ended up happening for me. I ended up doing all my own research and finding my way to integrated care.
Yeah, I do agree that it's quite common for people, especially like years back. I mean, I think overall we're getting better when it comes to information that we can gain from different tests and different practitioners we can work with. I think it is quite common for people who have some sort of inflammatory issue. You go to all the different doctors and the practitioners, and one is telling you this, another is telling you that. Sometimes you might leave thinking that you're crazy, which can develop into some sort of psychosis. And then, I do recall there was a time when people didn't really understand Lyme disease. And that was one of those things that came up quite a bit was, okay, maybe it's Lyme, right? Because that one is a hard one to diagnose, or even if you don't get a full diagnosis, right? Like, something's happening to you. And so, I do applaud you for having the wherewithal to be able to go and do your own research. I think this episode is going to be important for those who maybe don't have that capacity, who don't understand all there is to know and what research papers to read and which ones, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, right? And sometimes we just can't trust even our gut. And I think that's a good segue into Vitract, right? So I imagine once you figured out what was happening with yourself, how did you migrate into running? And
so this was years later. At the time of my diagnosis, I ended up working with a fantastic integrative care practitioner. We actually only worked together for about 6 months, 5 to 6 months. And the entire focus is very intense, but that entire focus was on healing the gut microbiome. And that, for me, completely reversed all my inflammation. It's been years and years since then. I've been completely healthy. That made such a big impact on my life. I went on to go do other things. I worked in banking for a couple of years. I built another longevity startup where we were looking at figuring out your biological age versus your numerical age. So I was always really into taking what we know in science and applying it into the real world. And one of the things that kept brewing in the back of my mind, my experience with working with this practitioner and how different my life would have been had I not gone down that path of taking my health into my own hand. And another thing that really, really stood out to me about that experience was everything from start to finish was out of pocket. The care, the supplements, the protocols, the testing. And the most expensive part of that entire care was the functional testing. I remember paying $600 out of pocket for a gut test, which for a student is a lot of money. And so I had to save up to get that test. So I kept thinking about this problem. And years later, I met my co-founder now, who's a PhD in molecular genetics. He spent over a decade in the lab sampling stool, figuring out how can we manipulate really complex ecosystems like the microbiome. And we put our heads together and we see this big opportunity in the microbiome space to make testing more affordable and to make it more actionable. And those were the two things that we were really working on.
So I would love to maybe backtrack just a bit so that I want to make sure that the people that we're speaking to in the audience, I want to make sure that they understand some of these things, because clearly there's going to be a number of people like practitioners and other gut experts out there who know everything you just mentioned, but then there's going to be a subset of people who don't. So can you explain a bit more what microbiome is and why that is something we should be interested in somewhat?
Absolutely. So the gut microbiome, think of it as a jungle. You have all of these different life forms that live there. You have bacteria, which actually make up almost entirely your gut. Over 95% of your gut is bacteria. But then you have other life forms. You have archaea, you have parasites, you have fungus, you have viruses. So you have all of these different types of bugs that live in your microbiome. And they actually play a really key role in modulating health and disease. So depending on what you eat, that kind of dictates the type of bugs that live in your microbiome. Different types of bacteria like to feed on different foods. So you are directly impacting the way that your microbiome composition really is. And then depending on what you eat and what bugs are living in your microbiome, those bugs are going to produce certain metabolites. And these are really key biomarkers that end up setting the stage for health or disease. These metabolites can vary anywhere from neurotransmitters, different short-chain fatty acids, other metabolites that link heavily with estrogen metabolism, things like longevity factors, toxins, oxalate degraders, lactose degraders. So these metabolites are key, and the bugs that live in your microbiome play a really key role in modulating what is being produced.
So I'm certain that people have heard of this difference, this interplay between good bacteria and bad bacteria. Can you touch on that a little bit? Because I do want people to understand that there are certain instances in which a person may need to take, what do they call it? What is it called?
Antibiotics.
Right. Yeah.
Correct.
So we know that some people need to take antibiotics for various reasons, right? But I think we need to make sure that people understand that sometimes can be like a nuclear explosion for all of the bacteria in the gut. So can you talk about that interplay between good and bad?
Yeah. So antibiotics are great in that they can be life-saving, right? But it's just the liberal use of antibiotics that can have, in situations where they're really maybe not needed, that can have a really negative impact on your health. So like you said, antibiotics have broad spectrum activity, meaning if they're trying to kill bacteria A, they're not going to really necessarily spare bacteria B or C. And the interesting thing is a lot of the bacteria in the gut microbiome, in the large colon, are anaerobic, meaning they really grow in the absence of oxygen, right? Meaning it's really hard to just go out there and buy a probiotic for every type of bug that lives in your gut. That just doesn't exist today. And so some of the times when you wipe out species completely, it can be really, really hard to bring those guys. So to go back to your point about good and bad bacteria, the terms that we use to sort of describe these bacteria are probiotic bacteria. These are your keystone species, the bugs in the microbiome that produce a lot of beneficial metabolites that your microbiome and your body need. And then you have your commensal bacteria. This is bacteria, think of it as your neutral bacteria that keeps the homeostasis of your microbiome. And then you have the pathobionts. So these are pathogenic bacteria that present in the gut, that their presence in the gut is actually quite normal, right? Like it's okay for them to be in the gut in small amounts. The problem is when they really overgrow, and that things that an example would be methanobrevibacter. When they overgrow, they're producing a lot of methane in the microbiome. And you can see why having excessive gas in there can cause bloating, right? They cause issues when they overgrow. And then the last type of sort of classification is exogenous pathogens. These are just pathogenic bacteria that should not be in the microbiome at all, even in small amounts, things like your H. pylori, salmonella, etc. So those are kind of the different classifications.
Yeah, like, and thank you for that explanation, because I think it's very well laid out. And one of the things that I like to do is especially for this show, I like to try to break things down in the simplest of ways. I don't even like to use the phrase dumbing it down, but I want to simplify it, which is why I call the show Simply Walk the Talk. I like to simplify some of these bigger conversations so that we can get the most out of it. And one of the things that I know lots of people have heard of is the term probiotic. And then there became, at some point, we, as a large group, we started to understand prebiotics, right? And then I think people started to coming around to understanding postbiotics. And so, like, what I used to say is that probiotics, like if a person just goes out and says, you know what, I heard probiotics are good, I need to get my yogurts, I need to do this and do that, and then just start taking a bunch of probiotics, I used to always say to them, listen, if you have a bad gut microbiome, if your gut flora is not optimized, then bringing in probiotics is only going to enhance, it's going to boost that already detrimental situation. And then the prebiotics typically are explained as those nutrients that feed the probiotics. And then
Yes.
if I'm correct in this, the postbiotics are those metabolites, or what comes after
Yes.
the ingestion of that. So if you could kind of just touch on that a little bit, because you're the expert here on this, and I just want to make sure that what I'm saying to people sometimes actually does make sense, and it would be nice to hear your response on that.
Yeah, the way you described is perfect. You can think of prebiotics as the food for probiotics, and then postbiotics as those metabolites that are produced. But to touch on your point that I think is really interesting is even beneficial bacteria that are probiotics, when they overgrow, can become a problem. And so it can be damaging to just go out there and buy a random, it can actually do more harm than good. And I'll take myself as an example. All of this craze today around pendulum Acromantia as a great probiotic, that's great, right? Like that's a breakthrough that we can now take Acromantia, right? But an Acromantia is one of those probiotics that we need. We absolutely need it. It produces some of those short chain fatty acids in the microbiome. But myself, as an example, over 20% of my microbiome is made up of Acromantia, and that's not good. For me, it's a problem that Acromantia has overgrown, right? I don't remember the exact numbers. This is on the report itself, but I think something like 2 to 5% of your gut should be Acromantia. So you can tell that for me, that specific probiotic is totally overgrown. And if I were to go out there,
can I pause you 1 second? I don't want you to lose your thought. Just so people understand what Acromantia is. Acromantia became very popular because it was found out people found out that those with a healthier metabolism, and usually in a lower weight classification, so to speak, typically had more Acromantia in their gut. So then therefore we should take more Acromantia to be more lean. But you're clearly pointing out that may not be the case for everyone. So yeah, just wanted to touch on that.
Exactly. Yeah. And it is funny, like it is impossible for me to put on weight, and maybe some of that is due to the Acromantia in my microbiome. But so if I were to go out there and say, okay, like we have this new great probiotic that everyone's talking about, let me go take some of that Acromantia. For me, that would be very damaging, right? Because I already have an overgrowth of it. So this is, I think, a prime example of why just grabbing random things off the shelf can sometimes be harmful, right? Even good products. That's why I always say test them.
Well said. And I think that's the perfect segue into Vitract, because it's like, I used to work with this company called Life Force, and one of the things I loved about their programming is that they were a program that for the first time in my career, where they suggest that we do not just one test a year, one blood test a year to kind of figure out what's happening in your body, but to do multiple. So they were saying, as much as once a quarter. And so if you're doing 3 or 4 blood tests a year, then you're getting a true understanding of what's happening in your gut. And I think their tagline was "Stop guessing and start addressing." And I think that landed on me so well. I resonate with that so much. And this reminds me of kind of like what you're doing, which is, because I didn't stop working with them because of anything bad that they did, but I was traveling so much, so I wasn't able to take part in all the things that they were sending me, and I wasn't able to benefit from all of the products that they support or supply, and all the testing, because I was on the road so much. But I remember, upon like finishing up and wrapping up that partnership, I was like, hey guys, it would be great if you could add in gut testing to all of your support. And they were like, oh, glad you brought that up, because that is one of the next things on their list. I don't know where they are with that, but I do think gut testing is important. And not only to know what you just talked about, which is maybe you have too much Acromantia in your gut, but also, we should maybe understand what's happening in our bodies so that we can figure out, like, should we take the supplement? Should we not? Right. And then I guess as you start talking about that, it would be nice to understand, how often should someone be taking a gut test, and maybe what you guys specialize in at.
Yep. So when practitioners come back to us and they ask, okay, how regularly should I be running this test for my client? We recommend every 2 to 3 months, when you're actively working with somebody on a protocol and you want to measure, okay, we tried this approach. Is it working? Is the bacteria moving in the right direction? If you're just using it as a preventative tool to stay on top of your health, you're feeling great, then you can extend that period out more. So it's more 3 to 4 months, or even pushing 5, 6 months, right? As long as you are running repetitive testing and you're able to say, okay, I can connect these biomarkers and see how I'm doing over time, you can sort of change the frequency depending on how you're feeling. Because the interesting thing is, as humans, our lives are changing all the time. We have stressful periods. We have easier, happier period, lighter period. And your microbiome is very responsive the way you're eating. Are you on the road all the time? Are you stressed all the time? Are you sleeping well these days? That stuff is going to change your microbiome. So you'll see that in different seasons of life, you will interact with these types of tools differently depending on how much or how little you need.
And so when it comes to, so I think that was very clear, and I think most people will be able to understand that. And I get it. I like how you separate this idea. Okay, maybe you're on a protocol because you are in a situation like maybe you were, which, you have a diagnosis, you need to really get this like figured out, right? So I would understand that makes sense to do it a little bit more frequently. And then if you're like someone like myself, for instance, who loves to kind of explore, I'm very curious about, okay, what's happening with this and what's happening with that, we can maybe do that less frequently. But what you pointed out is, and what I'm hearing is, we have to have some schedule, some repetitiveness, so that we understand what's really going on in the full picture. Now, how often does our gut bacteria, or our, microbiome, how often does it change typically?
Yeah. So this is a really good question, because your microbiome is responsive to your environment and what you're eating. But the way the microbiome changes longitudinally is over a couple of months period of time. So that's why we say, if you're working with a practitioner, give it about 2 to 3 months for that composition to actually meaningfully change, and then you can get retested. And I think this can be one of those things that's kind of frustrating to people, right? Is like, you can go out, buy a pill for something and see the impacts right away, right? But when you're using something like nutrition or natural supplements, probiotics, whatever, they take time. They take time to work. So it can take a couple of months for that composition to change.
So I think this is the big question, the elephant in the room, because let's say that a person is eager to get started right now. They're like, okay, Linta and Josh, shut up so we can like get to it. What does a test look like, right? Like, what does this mean? Like, I know some people have had resistance to providing poop to understand what's happening in your one of the ways that we can really understand what's happening, right? And so, if a person can kind of get out of this shame bubble, right, and not worry about, because at the end of the day we all poop, right? And so that is a really good way to show what's happening in your body. And so you can go to like the extreme levels and actually monitor your poop and take photos and things like that. You could do that. However, this is not that, right? And so are you guys testing poop? Are you taking poop samples? Are you doing blood testing? Are you leveraging both? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, look, if someone tells you they can measure the exact amounts of your gut bacteria using saliva, hair, or blood, or any of that stuff, don't believe them. We need to actually, you need to look at your stool to see what's in there. So it is a stool test. I will say one of the things that we've optimized for is the amount of sample that we need. So the way that this test comes to you at home in a box, and inside the box, there is a swab, right? And so what you're doing is essentially swiping that swab on the toilet paper. You're getting the smallest amount of sample, a grain of rice, and you're putting that back into the vial, stirring that up, closing it, putting it back in the box, and that's it. The whole process can take under 5 minutes. So it's a very quick and simple process. The reason I point that out is because I know in the past decade, there have been other tests that require you to take a large sample, put it in 5 different tubes, put it in the fridge next to your food, right? So I think we've been able to sort of take some of these advances in genetic testing and say, okay, this doesn't need to be put in the fridge because we have a vial with a buffer inside that sort of flash freezes that DNA. So you're good, and optimize for small sample size, etc. So we've made it as comfortable as you possibly can.
And quick story on that, because this is another opportunity to shout out Shaker Pie. So back in the day, this was kind of like at the beginning of COVID, actually. I was in LA doing work with Madonna, and I was in LA for about 10 months, and it was a great opportunity for me to actually reconnect with Shaker. It was actually the first time that we met in person, but we had talked on the phone and things like that. And he's been a really good resource, of course. And when I found out more about what he does as an internal medicine physician, we started to understand that, like, oh, you can do different tests out there. And I had talked to him about Viome, because at that time I had been using Viome, and I thought, like, yeah, no, I know what's going on in my gut. It's all good. And he's kind of like, well, there's better tests out there. And I'm like, well, talk to me. And so he had me go through the Genova diagnostics testing, which is really extensive and goes very deep. However, to your point, one of the things that was sort of frustrating for me, and keep in mind, I'm someone that is willing to kind of go to various links to find out what's working or what's not working. And so if I found myself being resistant to like the process, then I could only imagine what everyone else is feeling. And so I just said to Shaker, like, listen, bro, I want to help you to kind of get more people doing this. I'll be the guinea pig. However, like, I'm going to need you to come over here and help me, and no, he didn't have to scoop anything for me, but it was like, I think it was a 5-day test, which was great because you got a chance to see what's happening in your gut over that 5-day period. But it was a stool sample, it was a urine sample, blood sample, saliva. And I was just like, my goodness, like, if this is what a person has to go through to like understand what's happening in their body, like, I can't wait until someone comes out with something that is actually effective, but also way less intrusive. I mean, I felt like that was very intrusive because I had these containers in the refrigerator, and I was living with other people, right? So I'm kind of like, don't touch this area, okay, guys? Like, please. Anyway, so thank you for doing what you're doing, because I think now, this is what, 3 or 4 years later. Now we're at a point where we have Vitract. So I think that is very, very beneficial. And I wanted to say that just so people have an understanding of that. It's a lot easier now, thanks to you guys.
Mhm. Yeah. And thanks for sharing that experience. It's not uncommon for sure. And I will say tests like Genova are great. They're great tests, right? But the difference comes down to when you want to pull in different tools, right? Because something like a Genova is a fantastic deep dive pathogen test. If you are looking for a specific pathogen, you're going to be able to see if it's there or not. But the way the way that we look at the microbiome, and really the way it should be looked at, is trying to figure out how we can map the microbiome. This is a microbiome mapping approach versus a pathogen screen. And what that means is we try to figure out all of the bugs that are in there and classify them, the good ones, bad ones. What are they doing? How are they working together? Because usually when you can piece all those things together, you can see a pretty clear picture in terms of what could be happening. And so when I talk to clinics who are looking at onboarding our test, the way I talk about this also is there is a real need in the market for a fundamental, like foundational microbiome test. And this is what this is. This is the test you should always go to first. And then if there's additional need for a very specific pathogen that you're looking for as a practitioner, you're really playing detective, you're trying to figure out based on this specific symptom, I need to look for this thing. And then it makes sense to say, okay, now we're graduating to this like more expensive tool that's more invasive, but we really need it. So that's kind of the way to look at it.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I'm glad that you point out sort of, at least before we started recording, we talked about this difference between what you guys do for practitioners and then what you guys do for consumers. And so can we go there? Because I know that it was a big deal for you guys. And I think that's a huge boost in your company. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think the main way that we serve, this was a really, really intentional business decision, was that are we going to make this available only to practitioners like a lot of labs do? And I was very resistant to that because I know there's a lot of people out there like you and me who could benefit from this type of test, where I don't necessarily need to go work with a practitioner. If the report is designed in a way that I can read it, I can understand what's happening, then I don't need to work with a practitioner if I don't need to work with a practitioner. But then there's a lot of times where people have tricky cases. They have diagnoses for multiple different things. They need more handholding. They need more support. And in that case, it makes a lot more sense to work with a practitioner who can really simplify the process for you, because the gut microbiome is a very key, central, important thing to look at. But your health at large, there are other factors, right? There's hormonal health, there's blood biomarkers. So a practitioner can then say, I'm going to pull in a gut test and I'm going to pull in these other things and I'm going to paint together the picture for you. But if you're really, you're healthy, or you have GI upset or whatever it is, and you need to look at the microbiome, we've designed the test in a way that you can order the test as a consumer, you can access it, you can understand it, and it's very clear on how to action on modifying that bacteria.
And then is it true that a person, so let's say a consumer decides to just do it on their own, will they also have the support from one of your staff to help go through that, or do they need to go to their own person to do it?
Yeah, so we do have pre-recorded videos and sort of educational guides that we do share with customers when they ask for it. And the reason for that is I think there's so much that we know about biomarkers today. So the way that we've designed the test is you'll see a biomarker. So we'll take Acromantia as an example since we talked about it. And then you'll see the percentage that's in your gut. And then you'll see whether that's low, optimal, or high. And then whether that's low, optimal, or high, the next column is titled implication. And we'll tell you what the implication is if something is too low or too high. So we kind of piece it all together for you. Yeah. And I think it's quite easy to read, and we're there to provide support if you need it. And then beyond, if you need extra support, we also have a great list of practitioners that we can send your way.
So I was, for those that are watching the show, you noticed that I pulled up the screen on the website, vitract.com, to show kind of what that would look like, right? So you kind of have an understanding of, I would assume that you can get access to that through an app or at least through the website. And then it'd be on your profile so you can kind of see it. Most people today, that especially if you've ever gone to the doctor and gotten results through your phone or through an app, you're quite familiar with what that looks like. So I don't think that's novel in any capacity. However, I do think it's interesting that at least you have a snapshot of like, here's a focus. Okay, maybe now I can take the next step to say, let me reach out to the folks at Vitract, or actually, let me take this to my doctor because I see that these things might be really serious. And so I know that it's not necessarily providing a diagnosis, but it is a catapult, right? It's kind of like this beginning process to understanding what's happening specifically with you, right? And that's what's important. That's what's important. Yeah. So what do you find to be one of the biggest, or maybe a few challenges to some of the people that you're working with, or people that wanted to work with you but ultimately ended up not working with you? Like, what are some of those challenges? Price, difficulty of testing, traveling. What are some of those challenges?
Yeah, I think this is a really funny one. Is we see a lot of people who say, okay, I'm going to get a microbiome test. And once they get to their house, they go, all right, I'm going to take it this week. Oh, yeah, I'm taking it next week. Oh, I'm going to take it a few weeks from now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what we're trying to do now is, start sending follow-up emails to people, just as a way to activate them and remind them, like, sometimes a simple trick at taking the test kit and putting it in your bathroom can do the trick, right? So like, I think a barrier is that there is that mental barrier of like, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to collect this sample and send it off. And as humans, we can kind of justify anything. If you get something and you're like, yeah, I'm going to do it later, and then you delay it and you forget about it, that is one of the pain points that we've seen for people. Is so it can be really helpful to have reminders or little tricks, like keep it in your bathroom, or like if you have an appointment with a practitioner, you have to do it. So really just getting over that hurdle of collecting that sample and sending it off.
I'm so happy that you brought that up, because that was literally what happened with me. So here I am, like I spent all this money, because let's face it, anybody that's ever worked down this path, whether you've done Genova diagnostics or you've done some of these other gut testing situations, right? It's expensive. Let's just put it that way. Like you talked about earlier about doing everything out of pocket for a student, right? Let's just face it, $600 is expensive for most people, right? And I applaud you for attacking that, because if we want to get a true sense of what's happening in the world, we need to be able to allow more people to do some of these tests, right? But that barrier for me was kind of the same thing. Normally, I'm motivated by spending money on something, and then I'm like, I don't ever want to waste a dime, so I'm going to do whatever it is. But with the Genova test, I had that box sitting on my desk for about 6 weeks before I actually did it. Like literally. And that's when I finally reached out to Shaker and was just like, bro, listen, like, I know if you come all the way down from, I think he was living in like Los Feliz or something like that back then. So he would have had to travel like an hour and a half or 2 hours to get into LA. And the fact that he was willing to help me to kind of fill out this stuff, I was like, okay, this is going to motivate me to actually do it. And I needed an accountability partner. And so I'm saying all this to say that you're right? Do all the tips, tricks, tactics that is going to motivate you. And then if you really want to understand what's happening in your body, then you're going to do it. And I'm not going to say any names right now, but there is a person that I for sure am going to connect with as soon as we finish this podcast, because I want him to go through this, because he has done so much and he did the right thing by reaching out to me. But he's got some issues happening in his gut that almost no one can figure out. And so I'm like, who better to ask than Linta Mustafa? So I will be doing that, but I'm glad that you pointed that out. And I'd love to talk about pricing. And because pricing is one of those elephant in the room situations that we all are sensitive to. So can you talk about pricing and how you have it priced the way you do, and then what's on the horizon for all of that?
Yeah, our test is priced at $150, which
That's
is
it.
crazy because
Wow.
yeah. Slim, we've kept our margins super slim and tight because the main thing that we wanted to focus on was how can we change the game for the microbiome industry? And this is how. If you have affordable testing, it means more and more people will access testing. The family bundle is quite common. People buy that and it's like they'll run it for the test for their husband or their wife or their kids. So that in itself to me is a game changer, because if you're buying a $600 test, you'll maybe buy one, right? But you're not going to buy one for the whole family, or you're not going to gift it to people. So the way that people interact with the product, because it's more affordable, completely changes with the price. The way practitioners interact with the product changes the way they deliver care. And to me, that was super interesting, because before they would run one test, but it's really hard. Like, you have to sympathize with these practitioners. They have to go back to their patients and convince them maybe of doing it, of paying for it one time, but they're not going to be able to convince these patients doing it a second or third time, because it's just, it's out of reach in terms of price. Now they can get their patients to retest. They can measure if protocols are working. They can order tests for the whole family. So it really just changes the way that they interact.
And so two questions that come up from that piece. So it sounds like you can gift this to someone, right? So if you did the family bundle and got 3 tests, it sounds like you could, either use it for yourself, and that what brings up the other question. So if you are going to hoard your family bundle for yourself, is there like an expiration date on the test kit? If so, like, what is that? And then I would assume that if you are gifting it to a friend or a loved one, they would have to set up their own profile, obviously, right? But, because can you talk through that?
Yep. So you absolutely can gift it. Lots of people do that, and lots of people order it for their kids and family members. We've seen that a lot. So the way that you can do this is, to answer your first question, the expiration date is like 3 years. So it's a long time. And the way you can do this, if you're actually ordering the test for an elderly parent or a child, you can actually go and register their kit inside the portal yourself. Or if you're gifting it, you simply just gift it to your friend. They make their own account, they can register their own kit. So it can work out however you want it to.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting gift from JoshuaJHolland, right? Like, I can only imagine, because first of all, like, I'm the kind of guy that when I go over to someone's place or whatever, I'll bring like a healthy wine, if there's such a thing, or I'll bring something, that's kind of out of the box. Now I'm going to bring something in the box. So here you go. I want you to test your stool.
You should make it a requirement for them to share their results with you if it's
Right, exactly. Well, in all seriousness, I do think, because what I was trying to do with Viome back in the day, what I was trying to do was allow that to be sort of an entry point for my health coaching practice. And because I knew that I was able to obtain a lot of information and help people reach their goals if I knew what sort of foods they could eat or should not eat and stay away from, because I knew how that would affect their recovery, would also help affect their sleep, and which would then ultimately allow me to dictate how I train them, right? Because a person that is showing that they have a lot of stress and cortisol in their system based on the different hormonal markers and biomarkers, then why would I ever challenge them to the highest level with their training? It just doesn't make sense to me, right? And so anyway, so I feel like that is a really, really good tool. I think I'm going to, well, obviously we'll talk offline and we'll stay connected, but I want to find ways to implement this into every person I work with. And so if we can sort of understand what's happening with the system, then it allows me to do my job best, right? As a health coach, right?
Yeah. And I know I keep going back to this biomarker just because it's a simple one for people to understand. Say you're working with a client whose goal is to lose weight, right? You want to look at a biomarker like Acromantia. You will be surprised how many people come back with almost 0% Acromantia. And so if you're doing all these other things, but your main biomarker in your gut microbiome that activates Acromantia activates GLP-1, which activates fixing glucose into cells, taking it out of the bloodstream. If you don't have that process happening, it's really hard to sort of work towards those goals, right? So looking at these biomarkers can be like taking your training and your care sort of to the next level.
It sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for those out there who understand nowadays, I think a lot of people understand what GLP-1 means, right? Because of the Ozempic and all that stuff. But it sounds like Acromantia could be this endogenous Ozempic, right? It's what it sounds like.
It's touted as the natural Ozempic. And it really is, right? Like we understand Acromantia very, very well now. And it's been documented over and over and over in literature and how it activates GLP-1 naturally.
Which is really cool. And again, I think this is worth mentioning back to what we talked about previously, which is you need to know what's happening in your gut, because if you're like Linta and you have too much Acromantia, we don't need to be adding Acromantia, right? So, or at least we need to figure out ways to balance that. So that leads me to the next question, which is, okay, so say you've gotten your test, you sent it out, you got your results back. Quickly, how quick do the results come back typically?
From the time your sample reaches our lab, it takes about 2 weeks.
2 weeks. So when you get your results back, then do you guys supply suggestions on different supplements you can take? And if so, do you have direct access to those supplements or those protocols? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so this is really our baby in terms of what we worked so much on the test was the last section that focuses on bacteria modifiers. How can you modify the bacteria? The so what of the equation, right? Because I think there's a lot of value in showing people if their biomarkers are too low or too high and what that means. But if you can't tell them what to do, then I think, you're not really closing the loop. And so what we've done is we've built this massive data infrastructure and engine where we pull in thousands of research papers and we try to figure out what nutrient has what impact on what bacterial group. Meaning, if we know that if increasing your intake of cherries can really increase the amount of Acromantia that's in your microbiome. So like things like that, trying to figure out how we can modify these biomarkers. And so in the last section of the test report, you'll see that we take in everything, we pull in everything that was out of range, and then we give you suggestions on how you can push it into the right ranges. So these suggestions can be food. So right there where it says on the report, it says if you want to see a sample report, if you click download test report, this is a great way to actually get a sample report sent to your email. But yeah, we tell you in terms of food, prebiotics, probiotics, supplements, and lifestyle changes, how we, 5 different approaches on how you can modify all of the different bacteria that was out of range. So the recommendation engine is quite robust. And I think that's truly where the innovation is in the microbiome space.
That's really cool. So here, I'm just going to show quickly the report that just came up that you mentioned. Let me see if I can get this to open on here, because I think I have to do this as a screen. So just bear with me for one moment, because I think this is really cool. Okay, so for those of you that are listening, I am showing the sample report Linta was just talking about. And so this is pretty cool because this is a gut microbiome analysis. So this is, I guess, what it would look like. You've got the 0 to 49 represents poor, the section that represents needs work, the satisfactory section. And so, yeah, if you want to walk through some of this, I think this is cool.
Yeah. So at the very top, you have your gut health score. It's like a quick pulse on how the amalgamation of your entire score. Right underneath is your diversity score. We know the more diverse a microbiome, the healthier microbiome. So that's actually a really key thing to look at. And 87, that's actually a great score. If you go down, this section 2 is all about bacteria life forms. So if you look at that number 1 right there, you have Acromantia. For this person, 0.11% of their microbiome is made up of Acromantia, which is much lower than the optimal range, which is about 1 to 5%. And then in the
Interesting.
implication section, we tell you what low levels of Acromantia could mean for you. And then we do this for all the biomarkers. So you can see how easy this is to read. Like as a layperson, you can pick this up and read it, right? And I think that was one of the things we were trying to optimize for, is a lot of these other stool tests kind of read like lab reports. And if you're not trained to read a lab report, you can't read it. So if you keep scrolling, we show you the probiotic bacteria. We show you the commensal bacteria, which I was mentioning can give really interesting insight on the way you're eating. Like I can take a look at this test result and tell you whether you're eating more plant-based or you're eating, more protein-based, because the biomarkers there will give it away. And then if you keep scrolling, you'll see the pathobiont section, which is the pathogenic bacteria. So you have your inflammatory LPS producers, you have hydrogen sulfide, gas, hydrogen sulfide producers, methane producers. So you see like the optimal. This is kind of what you want to see in terms of, in the pathogen section. If something is too high or too low, it will come up. And then you see the exogenous pathogen section right there. This is really ideally what it should look like. All of these things should come up non-detected. If they come up detected, it means you likely have food poisoning or something of that sort. This is something great to share with a doctor or a practitioner. And then the next section is all about the bugs that are there. What are they producing? So everyone is talking about butyrate these days, right? Like we know butyrate is a very important short-chain fatty acid for us in the microbiome. You can supplement with butyrate, or the bacteria in your bug, in your microbiome, those bugs naturally produce butyrate, right? So do you have enough butyrate producers? And you can find out that information here. Neurotransmitters, vitamin producers.
Is butter one of those? Does butter help with that?
I don't really know. I don't really know.
I've heard that it does. I've heard that butter is a really good form of butyrate. But again, that just assumes that the gut is optimized and whatnot. So yeah, sorry. I just was just curious.
Yeah, we'll see. And you'll see when we get down to the recommendation section, everything will be, personalized to every single unique individual's microbiome. So this is the section that I was talking about, Josh. Like you and I can take this test, and our test results and our recommendations are going to look completely different because our microbiome composition is different. So let me talk about how to read
this. This is great. I love the foods to include and foods to avoid. I love that. And before you go into it, I think it's important to note that like Linta mentioned early on in the show, this is a snapshot in this period of time. So yes. I want to make sure people don't think that when they see foods to avoid that they could never have ethanol or cacao or pumpkin or whatever. Don't think of this as like you can't have it ever. It's just right now in this snapshot is saying that your gut is not optimized to be able to handle that right now.
Exactly. That's exactly right. It's not that you should be including cranberry, rye cherry heavily in your diet for the rest of your life. It's that you need those things right now because those will increase a specific biomarker that's low for you and you're trying to balance it out. And to me, this is super fascinating because one of the things that we've done that I haven't seen any other company do out there is one of the problems that we saw was it's really elusive and confusing where these recommendations are coming from usually. So what we've done is we put the scientific evidence right next to the suggestion. If you want to see the research papers that back up any of these claims, you can click into them, you can read the research papers. And so that to me is a game changer.
That is huge. And then you have the lifestyle changes as well, which is huge. I mean, like even just on this last one here, because like I mean, obviously there's different suggestions on these things, but what I see on this bottom one here is what to avoid. Well, like on this specific example, by the way, this is just a random example, everyone. But it says the lifestyle changes is to include ketogenic diet, high fiber diet, fruit, legume, fiber, and nuts, right? And that might not be for everyone. Obviously, this is for this individual. But then the things to avoid, which is interesting, and one of the first ones I see here, it says to avoid far infrared sauna for this particular example, low FODMAP diet, hypocaloric, hyperprotein diet, and a low protein diet. So these are things to avoid. And I find that to be very interesting. So
Yeah.
some good, some
Yeah. And Josh, if you see right next to, for example, where it says sauna, right, or far infrared sauna, it has a number right next to it, the number 2. And the bacteria shifted. The reason to avoid it is because it reduces Acromantia. And for this person, we saw that it was already very low. And then if you see number 2, on the scientific evidence, it links to the research paper that shows far infrared radiation induces changes in the microbiome. So it shows you why we're showing you this.
Yeah, so I want to share that one because I did show the infrared study. So here it is, just as an example, just to kind of keep this piece going. But this is a PubMed article or study that shows exactly what you just mentioned and why that is. And so so this is interesting because I didn't know that, by the way. I did not know that far infrared sauna has been known to reduce Acromantia, but this sounds like this might be one of those protocols that would be something that you would have done to reduce your Acromantia. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is.
Wow. That's very interesting. I did not know that. Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. So as you guys can see, obviously Linta and I are geeking out over all this stuff around the gut and whatnot. And like, I'm excited to get my hands on this, my gut on this, right? And I have no doubt that we will do some work together. And depending on how all that goes, like with myself and with some of my clients, I'd love to kind of revisit some of these things because I know before we started recording, I had told you that I listened to a different podcast that you were on a few years ago. And you're like, oh my gosh, we've changed so much since then. And it looks like you guys have changed for the better. So this is great. This is wonderful. Congrats.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for pulling it up. I think it's so magical to actually see something on paper. And for a lot of people, when they're trying to make big, meaningful changes in their lives and their health journey, seeing it and empirical data of what's happening inside your body can make all the difference. So thanks for playing that.
Yeah, and that's one piece of it, right? Like seeing the data is one piece, and maybe turning on that light bulb to activate you to get you off your butt, right? Or get you on your butt or whatever, right? But then to then take that and hopefully see some beneficial changes, that's what makes everything work beautifully, right? You don't have to do this for the rest of your life, but you can do this for a part of your life until things aren't optimized. If you don't feel good, like let's figure out why you don't. And I think we should normalize this idea of testing our stool. We should normalize this conversation around the gut because we hear people say, oh, I have a gut feeling, right? We know that the gut is very important in our world. And I think we should do ourselves a service by getting away from this idea, well, everyone should be plant-based. Everyone should be carnivore. Everyone should do fasting. How about we find out exactly what's happening in your gut and see what works best for you specifically? And I think Vitract can help with that. But yeah. Linta, is there anything else that we may have missed in terms of what you wanted to talk about before I start getting into some out-of-the-box questions for you?
No, I think I'm just super excited for people to be able to access this test. We will have a discount code that we can share with your listeners as well. So I'll be sure to send that to you after.
Yeah, I'll make sure and put that in the show notes. People love a discount, especially a vetted discount. And as many of you know, I definitely do not promote anything that I haven't tried myself. And so I'm going to be the first to jump on that. And I will use the discount code as well. And I'll be one of the first to jump on that. I'll let you guys know what the journey is all about. And, let's see what can change, because I know there's so many people who behind the scenes they might look good aesthetically. I have some friends that are just completely ripped, and everyone thinks, wow, they must be the healthiest person alive because look at them. But behind the scenes, we have too much shame to actually admit that their guts are screwed up, right? And so again, I have another friend of mine that I won't say names, but I will definitely be suggesting that he gets on this, because we can figure out what's happening. And I think it's also important to point out that your gut not only affects your aesthetic, but it also affects your cognition and your mental state, right? And so if you're dealing with depression, anxiety, you have ADHD, you have brain fog, maybe it's the gut. So let's find out. So, okay, question for you. What is, this one's not so out of the box. What is one or two of the biggest sort of obvious changes that you see based on all the testing that you've done? Like, what is one or two of the biggest takeaways that you've seen most people get results from with your testing?
Okay. Some of the biggest changes.
Do you see 100%? Does everyone come to you and say, "Oh, this was it. I figured it out," or is there something else that you see?
Yeah. Okay. So the most obvious ones are that sometimes a simple probiotic, in terms of this keystone probiotic species, was completely wiped out. Sometimes there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in these tests, meaning that you say, really common species like Bifidobacterium, Lactobacillus, stuff that you can so easily get probiotics off the shelf for, people have in very low amounts or zero amounts. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruits in terms of simple probiotics that people can take that would really change the game for them. And people don't realize that if you have completely wiped out an entire probiotic species, no amount of nutrition is going to fix that. Like if it's at zero, you have to reseed it with a probiotic, and then you can feed it. Sometimes I see low-hanging fruit like that where the solution is just so quick and obvious. And then other times we see things in the lifestyle section that have really worked for people that are sometimes just very intuitive, but we forget things like, instead of taking 5 minutes to eat your food, take 30, 40 minutes, like really chew, like increase your water intake and how quickly or slowly you're chewing your food. And they'll see that right away, their digestion gets better. So sometimes it's the low-hanging fruit that can really get you from 0 to 1. But it's that getting from like 1 to feeling your best is when you really want to get into the details and optimize. But there's a lot of simple things you can do to sort of get to that 0 to 1 place.
Okay. The golden question, one of the golden questions, what is the optimal transient time? So like, what do you,
how often should
not
you
even
poop?
time, but like, yeah, there you go. Exactly.
At least daily. Yeah.
At least daily. At least once daily.
At least once daily. And I'm glad that you asked this, because things like constipation are so common. They're so common, but because it's just slightly uncomfortable and you think, all right, this is just happening for a little while, you just ignore it, right? And lots of people ignore things like that, and then most people who have constipation have chronic constipation. They've had it for years and years and years. And actually read a really interesting research paper recently that was looking at patients with Crohn's and colitis. And before they had those diagnoses, they had chronic constipation for years and years that they were just ignoring. And so, I think you should go daily. And if you're not, is a clear indicator of you need to do something. Something needs to change. So
well said.
It's all about being aware.
Okay. And then the opposite end of that spectrum. So what if someone is going, 6 times a day, 10 times a day, loose stools, things like that. Like, is there something in that that also raises alarm bells?
Yeah, absolutely. That's another indicator that there's something wrong. For both, the interesting thing is for both ends, there are biomarkers that can tell us why those things could be happening. So if you look at your methanobrevibacter that I was bringing up earlier, these methane gases being produced in the gut, they can really slow down your transit time of food moving across the GI tract. So there's something wrong there that you can be looking out for. But on the other side, if you're having loose stool constantly, there might be certain things in the exogenous pathogen section. So things like salmonella, do you have food poisoning? Did you pick something up? Maybe it's a parasite, right? So on both ends, those are clear indicators of your body begging you to make a change, to pay attention. I think if you're experiencing either of those symptoms, this might be the catalyst to actually go out and do something.
And forgive me if you already answered this because I can't recall, but do you have like a direct tie-in to different supplement companies with your product, with your company?
We don't. The way that we've laid it out right now is we tell you the exact species that you need, and then you can go out and look for those species. What we really wanted to get away from was partnering with certain companies and then pushing those products on people. What we want to tell people is this is the species that you need, and you can find it in a lot of different products, but getting down to like getting exactly what you need.
Okay. No, that's very, very helpful. Okay, great. Let me think now. Let's get fun with this because we're going to start wrapping this up, but I want to just get to know you a little bit more. You're doing some amazing things in the world, and I really think that this is one of those key pieces that I want to add into my practice. And so I hope that there's other people watching and listening that want to do the same thing. And so, of course, I'll make sure that we have all your information here. But I was curious about your own personal journey. When you mentioned that you find it hard to put on weight, it made me wonder what you do in terms of fitness and movement and things like that. Like, what is your exercise routine look like, or what does your daily routine look like?
Yeah. Well, as you can tell, I have a job that's very encompassing. I find myself working a lot. And so when it comes to movement, I take it in seasons now. As a collegiate wrestler, trained hours and hours and hours a day, and I don't have those hours anymore. So I just, depending on how things are in my life, people who know me well, they know I'm always doing something new. Like every quarter, I do something new. I like pick up a different sport, or for 4 months, I'm going to work with a trainer, and for another 4 months, I'm going to join a soccer team, and for another. So I like to switch it up all the time now. So right now I'm on a swim team that lasts the whole summer. So I swim for a couple hours in the evenings. But that's going to end in September, and I'll pick up something new. But beyond that, I try to take most of my calls while I'm walking. So if I don't need to be sitting and, doing a face-to-face, then I try to walk. So just like after meals, I'm always up, even if it's 5 to 10 minutes, even if it's, such a short period of time, always just getting in a little bit of movement, even if I'm just walking around the office or walking around the house. So just building in those things into my everyday life, but also keeping it fresh.
Okay, that's wonderful, amazing. You're a lot like me. I love to kind of mix things up, similar to what happens in our gut, happens on our bodies, right? Like, we change ever so often. So why not change, the practices and the movements that we take on? And one question that I have, and then I swear we'll wrap this up, but part of the reason why I like to ask various out of the box questions, because it usually leads to another set of sub questions. So the question I have is, when you do your swimming, are you indoors or outdoors?
Outdoors. It's
Outdoors.
summer.
Okay. Okay. All right, good. Well, because here's why I asked that. And you probably already know where I'm headed with this. Part of the reason why I love swimming, I think it's amazing. However, I'm one of those people that is like a canary in a coal mine. If I am anywhere near chlorine, like, things don't work well, right? I just don't feel good. And so there was a point in time when I researched why that is, and come to find out that chlorine has a huge impact on your gut. So I was curious to know if you've also seen that from the research perspective. Is that something that you have found out with other people?
Yeah. And I did the same research when I was joining the swim team because I thought like, it's no surprise that chlorine isn't great for you. It's on your skin. It's in your hair. A lot of the times when you're swimming, you get it in your mouth. Like you drink some of that pool water inevitably. And for me, it was just this trade-off of like, I don't swim all year round. When I was in high school, I was on the swim team, so I did swim. I did swim like the whole season. For me, I swim in the summer. I swim in the outdoor pool, which I know being outdoors helps to sort of dissipate some of that chlorine that gets absorbed into the air. So it is a little bit better, but I definitely feel it. Like the summers that I'm swimming, I don't feel as great. Like my skin is drier, my hair is drier. And, I do other things. And like I take chlorella, for example, when I get out of the pool.
I was just going to say that. Thank you. Good.
Yeah. So I do what I can to best support the body. And I love the workout. So I still do.
Yeah. So quick tip here. So Linta already touched on one of those, but whenever someone asks me, because, I have two small kids that I try to do my best. They live in Budapest, and whenever I see them, but we go and do all the things. And it's kind of like, yes, I have a sensitivity to gluten, but if I'm with my kids, they're having a great time. Like it's very rare that they have gluten, but if we're at a kid's birthday party or something, I'll join in with them and moderate it, right? And in small doses, just to enjoy the moment with them. And the same thing goes with swimming. So they love swimming, and so they get into the pool. However, if I'm ever going to get into a chlorinated situation, two things I do. I use shea butter, organic shea butter, all over my body to help create this natural layer of protection for the skin. And it's almost like waterproofing my body. So that's a really good tactic, not only for the chlorine, but also for the sun. We need sun. However, the shea butter is a really good, it's almost like coconut butter or coconut oil. I think it's a little bit better than that because it's thick. And so I like shea butter in any time that I'm going to be in a chlorinated pool. And another thing is I take spirulina and chlorella together. So the blue-green algae is a really good detoxifier. And then similar to you, I'll add in coconut charcoal, once I'm finished with the swimming. So all those things help to kind of bind to those toxins. And of course, I'm not going to be doing that every day. I'm not going to be doing that all day. But these are some of the things that I would do. So if you're in a situation where you find that you need to be in a chlorinated pool and you find yourself having gut issues, try that out. Maybe take this Vitract test to also see what else is going on in your body. But that might be a good tip for you. So, okay, this has been fun. I learned a lot. I'm excited to kind of get testing. And I promise that I will not let this sit for 6 weeks before doing it. Yeah. Can you let people know the best ways to be in touch with you? I know we showed some things from the website and things like that, but are you on social media? What's the protocol there?
Yes, the company, it's so Vitract Official, that's the name, is on social media. We respond to all of our DMs. You can DM the team personally. I'm on social media as well. The best way to go order a test is through the website. It's vitract.com or .ca if you're in Canada. And once you get a test and you log in and you're registering that kit, there's also inside that dashboard when you log in, space to ask questions. So if you ever need to interact with the team, that's the best way to do so.
And as pointed out, we will give a discount code once we get all that set up. We'll have that in the show notes. And you touched on another important thing. It sounds like this is good for, even though you're based in Toronto, this is good for the US and Canada. So that's important to point out. All right. Well, Linta, thank you for your time. Thank you for all the work and research and the dedication you have to what you're doing. I can tell that this is a huge passion for you. So kudos to you and all that you've built. This is amazing. And hopefully we stay in touch and we'll bring you back on next time when I have my own results. All right.
Yeah, that'll be super fun. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you. All right. Until next time, everyone, this is Josh from Simply Walk the Talk. Peace.
Simply walk the talk.
Walk the talk, talking facts. Move like me, but I move a little fast. Make my move, here to last. Fasten these seat belts, I'm coming past. Take care of me, longevity. Hack my biology, better believe. Walking the talk, soul, mind, and body connected. Better come give us a listen.